Hi, everyone. My name is Eden Cho, and I'm a museum educator at the National Museum of American History. And welcome to the 2022 National Youth Summit on Democracy. The National Youth Summit is our annual program on civic education, bringing together secondary students with scholars, policy experts, and activists in a national conversation about important events in America's past that have relevance to the nation's present and future. If you've joined a National Youth Summit program with us in the past, you may notice our format looks a little bit different this school year because we are dropping not just one, but three case studies over the course of the 2022-2023 school year and culminating in a teach-in event in April 2023. So before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Please ask any questions you may have in the chat box by commenting there, and our guests will answer them live. We only ask that you keep your personal information private. We don't need them. I'll also be utilizing the chat to drop important information such as forthcoming case studies and where you can find today's resources. This video will stay live or it'll stay archived at the same link. So feel free to come back to it and watch again as needed. And I am going to turn over the introductions to our moderator today, Orlando Serrano.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eden, and thank you for being with us to think through the idea of democracy over the course of three case studies this 22-23 academic year. My name is Orlando Serrano, and I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History. And I'm happy to be joined by Megan. Megan, may you please introduce yourself?
Yes, good evening. My name is Megan Linehan, and I realize I should have advanced the slide. I am also a museum educator at the Museum of American History, and I've been working on this particular case study in the National Youth Summit programming, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about what I've learned and on this topic, and dive into what the case study can offer teachers and the middle school and high school students who join us.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Before we get into our conversation for today, can you share a little bit about what you were doing before you got to American history? What is your experience, and what are you bringing to us here throughout the National Youth Summit?
Sure. So I've been in education for over a decade now. I've taught middle school and high school history in the Washington, D.C. area. And I've also worked with adults teaching ESL. Then I have experience with after school programming and writing instruction. So that all led me here to the museum, and I actually had worked on a previous case study for the National Youth Summit all the way back in 2019, I believe, and that was the National Youth Summit on women's suffrage. So I was excited to have an opportunity to come back and work on this program again.
Very cool. Yeah, we're grateful to have your experience and your expertise with us at American History, and we're excited to learn with you here about 1970s American Indian activism. So let's get into it. All right, there was a lot going on, both leading up to and during the 1970s. We'll get into the context a little bit later on. But the first case study that we're going to be looking at centers on an event that's called the Longest Walk, or has come to be known as the Longest Walk. And it is what we're using to get at the question, what happens when all or part of your identity is not included in the narrative of US democracy? So can you tell us a little bit about the moment, the decade that led up to the Longest Walk?
Definitely. So we're going to start by talking about the American Indian movement. And so in this picture here, you can see a drum and amplification set that was actually used by an activist who was part of this movement. And so the American Indian Movement, AIM here in the drum, was formed in 1968. And this was a pan-Indian national organization that was formed to raise awareness about the problems in American Indian communities and to challenge the plans that were in Congress at the time to abrogate or abolish some of the Indian treaties that protected their rights and their ability to self-govern. So in terms of what this movement looked like in that decade, you had organized demonstrations and property takeovers of symbolically significant locations around the United States by American Indian activists. This included an occupation of the island of Alcatraz in 1969. There was an earlier march that ended in actually a sit-in a week-long sit-in at the Bureau of Indian Affairs in DC. That was in 1972. And then there was a pretty tense confrontation at Wounded Knee in 1973 between one Indian nation there, American Indian Movement activists and US federal troops. So all of this is to say that there was a lot of organized activism happening in the 1970s. And what set this apart from maybe earlier organization by American Indians is that it was at a national level and it was meant to raise awareness about national issues. As opposed to more localized actions by individual nations. And I also want to point out that there are lots of different American Indian nations, and they have different cultures and maybe different issues and different ideas about how to solve things. But there's one common goal that unites this movement and a lot of American Indian activism, and that is the idea of sovereignty. Or the ability to self-govern and make choices for the members of their communities and to preserve their identities and cultures after many years of hostile policies that had been implemented by the United States government.
Thank you. Thank you for the background, for the context that led us up to the longest walk, specifically within the American Indian movement, and pointing out, and for folks who may not be familiar with or thinking through the idea of sovereignty, we're going to get into a little bit here because sovereignty is actually very important. It's a very important organizing principle for Native American communities, American Indian movements, as Megan has pointed out in her run-up to the longest walk, but it continues to be an important matter for American Indian communities, for Native American communities today, and has to do with the relationship between two sovereign governments. And when two sovereign governments make arrangements and agreements with one another, it's usually done around a treaty. And a lot of these treaties between the US government and Native American tribes and communities and governments have been broken and abrogated, as Megan pointed out. Can you give us some of the examples of the policies that folks are still continuing to contend with today?
Well, let me provide just maybe a little bit more of the historical context of sort of what this movement was reacting to. And these questions, these issues are still very much around, but let me give you a little bit of the context. So as you mentioned, there were a lot of treaties signed between independent American Indian nations and the US government. But as the US population grew in the 1800s, more land was needed by these settlers. And so the US government implemented a policy of removal. And you may know this as the Trail of Tears, where Eastern Indian nations were forcibly removed from their homelands to reservations in the West. And then later in the 1800s, these sort of policies continued, but with a shift. So now you saw a push to assimilate, to ban traditional cultural and religious practices, as well as to divide up the reservations that the Native Americans had been living on into more individual allotments. Then in the 1930s, 1934 specifically, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, and this actually provided a brief respite. The government had realized just how much damage the policies of removal, assimilation, and allotment had done. And so this act restored tribal governments and ended the allotment policy. However, very soon after that, in the 1950s, there was a trend in Congress that was once again looking to restrict the rights of American Indian nations and break up tribal reservations. So we'll talk about the long-term effect of this movement and where this sort of ended up. But at that point, there were threats to the idea that American Indians should have the right to control their land, to pay and support, to use money to support the people living there. So for like healthcare, education, things like that. And so there was a really kind of complicated bureaucracy, if you will, between these nations and the US government. And they were often either dealing with these really hostile policies or neglected. And so that's the backdrop to what these American Indian activists were reacting to when they formed and did these actions.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Sort of, if we step back a little bit and think about what was going on in the United States as the American Indian movement officially took off in 1968, right? It was coming at the tail end of what we understand as the height of the civil rights movement, right? Following the murder of Emmett Till and MLK and the People's March on Washington and SNCC and all the other folks who were involved in the civil rights movement. It comes sort of right on the crest of a lot of what has become known as sort of like the third world left, right? Where you've got folks like alongside the American Indian movement, we have the Young Lords who have to do with a lot of specific Puerto Rican identities and issues around Puerto Rican communities. We've got the Brown Berets and the Chicano movement coming up with the importance of Mexican American and Chicano identity. We've got the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense that is also going on around this time. And we've got East Wind, which is also addressing the needs and desires of parts of Asian American diaspora. And then this all culminates in 1969 with the founding of the Ethnic Studies Department at San Francisco, right? Which is within the ethnic studies realm is a very important date and an important event. However, you have done a lot of work to point out how the American Indian movement is different, and we want to address what sets this movement apart. Not that it's not in alignment with or in solidarity with all of these other movements, but what does make the American Indian movement unique?
Yes, thank you for sharing the context of what else was going on at that time. But I do want to paraphrase one of the curators I talked to over at the Museum of American Indian, Paul Chott-Smith. And one of the most complex aspects of doing the research for this case study and for understanding this movement and where we are today, it's to point out that tribal sovereignty is in the USA is incredibly unique. There is no other ethnic group that gets to have things like its own courts and police forces and laws, with limits, of course. But he wanted to make sure that that we understood that American Indians are US citizens, so therefore civil rights do apply to them as individuals. But they can also be members of these independent tribal nations, and therefore these nations have specific and very special rights. And so civil rights and the rights of the sovereignty that was at the forefront of this movement in the 1970s were complementary, but not the same thing. And to maybe add a little bit more to the complexity of this, as it stands right now under US law and tribal sovereignty today, American Indians, their nations are a political and not a racial category. So it's not necessarily about culture or ancestry. And my understanding is that each tribal nation can set the terms of citizenship for that nation. And the US government does not have a say in that. So it's complicated, it's challenging, but it is very, very unique, and it speaks to this question of identity when you have at least these two identities, if not more, navigating your way through US history and where you fit.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Megan. And for setting up the context, for helping us know where the longest walk was entering, both in larger US civil rights and liberation struggles within the United States, and specifically what set the American Indian movement apart. I would be remiss if at this point I did not mention the book by Professor Ned Blackhawk called The Rediscovery of America. If you are interested in further understanding sovereignty and its role in US history, that is a great book that was just recently published. I invite you to check that out. Okay, but let's focus now on the longest walk. All right, Megan, what do we got here?
Okay, so we're going to do a thinking routine with this poster that we see here. So Orlando, I'm going to ask you to make some observations using the See, Think, Wonder routine, which we are borrowing from Harvard's Project Zero. And so first, if you look at this poster, and I hope it's big enough for you, let me know if you need me to zoom in. But I'd just like you to make some observations about what you see.
Well, let's see here. I see two figures. I see, well, there's a price for admission, which I'm always looking at. But I also see sort of an interesting organization of folks who are involved, it looks like, with the event for what is titled at the top, the Longest Walk Benefit Concert. I see that it's a DC Armory, and in terms of the location. And I'm, so those are, all right, I'm gonna stop there because those are the things that I see.
Okay, great. So you made a bunch of observations there. What do any of those observations that you see on this poster, what do they make you think about?
Well, so seeing the name of Muhammad Ali right at the very, very bottom makes me think about some of the stances that he took with regard to US policy in particular, right? He famously lost his heavyweight belt because he refused to go to Vietnam when he was drafted. So, that makes me think again of the connections between what AIM is doing with regard to US policy and what Muhammad Ali did with regard to US policy. Okay, no, that's all. That's the main thing I think. That's the main thing I think. I think I have lots of wonders.
Okay, well then you you are anticipating our third question. What are some of the things that you wonder about this poster?
Yeah. So I wonder how these folks all know each other. Dick Gregory, which is a famous comedian. We've got folks. So like, I wonder about the solidarity work being done here. I mentioned earlier that AIM was right at the crest of what some people also call it the Third World Liberation Front, where BIPOC communities were coming together to ask for more specifically representation in colleges and universities with regard to curriculum. But so I'm curious I wonder about the solidarity movement that happened solidarity building that happened for these folks to all come together. I wonder why the DC Armory. I also wonder what was going on around the DC Armory at the time. as someone who lives in Washington, Washington DC, I'm curious about that. I also wonder about the drawings themselves of the two figures. I wonder the significance of the attires, even potentially the body language, what the folks are holding in their hands. Yeah, those are some things I wonder. So Megan, can you tell us a little bit about this poster?
I can. I don't know if I can answer all of your wonders, but I can tell you a little bit more about this. So this was one of the many posters that were created to advertise and raise awareness about the march. And so the longest walk was a 3,000-mile journey. So the activists left San Francisco, and I'm not sure. I think some of them might have flown, but people did make it across the 3,000 miles to DC, where they were joined by other local activists and allies. And so this march, this 3,000 miles from San Francisco to DC, was, I believe, symbolically chosen by the organizers to represent the federal government's history of forcing American Indians from their homelands, as I mentioned earlier. And so this happened in DC in July 1978. And you notice the two figures there that seem to be dressed maybe in more traditional regalia. And during this time that they were in DC, they held rallies and tribal ceremonies and really centered American Indian culture and practices, as well as lobbying politicians against some of the legislation that they were worried about. And as you mentioned, you noticed some very famous names. And there was a lot of crossover between elements of the civil rights movement and the other groups that you've mentioned here tonight. And so you'll see, yeah, like Dick Gregory, Muhammad Ali, very prominent, well-known, not only comedian and boxer, but also very active in the civil rights movement. So again, like very complementary movements. And so you saw people from other groups supporting this cause as well. And so there's Buffy St. Marie. She's a Canadian-born Indigenous musician, artist, activist. Richie Havens, also a musician. So you had a combination of some very prominent American Indian entertainers and activists joined by these African American activists as well. And so what they did is they lent their significant star power to this event and were able to use their national platform to raise more mainstream awareness of the issues that American Indian communities were facing. And I believe that this particular benefit concert also helped raise money for the protesters to return home at the end of the longest march.
Thank you, Megan. Well, we are coming on the end of our time together tonight. So I'd like to ask, what is some of the long-term impact of the longest walk? How can we see the remnants of this event with us today?
Sure. So the American Indian Movement, as a very prominent national organization, kind of died out by this time. However, that doesn't mean that it didn't have a significant impact. In the short term, those termination bills in Congress that I mentioned, though they were unlikely to pass, they did not pass. And in fact, legislation in the 1970s did pass that preserved rights to practice their own religions and to preserve that sovereignty or self-government that we have stressed here tonight. This overall movement also inspired a somewhat of a cultural renaissance to preserve their languages, their cultures, and their spiritual practices. And the longest walk specifically, there have been 4 other long walk marches since 1978. And in the similar vein, each is meant to raise awareness and spotlight some pressing issues. And even more recently, we see a long legacy of American Indian activism in what most of our audience will probably be familiar with, the Dakota Access Pipeline, where members of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation and their allies protested the construction of an oil pipeline that would challenge their sovereignty and threaten their natural and cultural resources. So the complexities of American Indian identity and sovereignty are definitely still being navigated today, but you can still see this legacy of activism by members of these different American Indian tribes also still very much alive and well today.
Well, thank you, Megan, for sharing all this information about the Longest Walk, about the work of AIM, the legacy of this organization that is still with us today. And so for folks who are joining us now, or folks who are going to find this webcast later on, what are some of the resources that are available for folks who want to engage with this case study a little bit more deeply, and where can they go to find it?
Okay, so I think Eden's going to throw these links in the chat as well, so don't worry, you'll be able to get to them. But the first thing is, if you are an educator, a parent, a student, and you are looking to learn more, we really hope that you'll engage with the case study. If you go to this link here, this s.si.edu/MYS, that is where you will find digital versions of the case study, a teacher guide for implementing it in your classroom, and this archived webinar will also live there as well. And then within the case study, there's such a robust history around this, and there was just too much to fit, but we've included a lot of links to additional resources to help you dig deeper into this topic. So we'll hope that you will check that out. We also invite you to explore the work of our colleagues at the National Museum of the American Indian. Not only are there exhibits both in person and digital excellent, but they also have something called the Native Knowledge 360 initiative, and that is particularly targeted towards teachers and students, and it has all sorts of lesson resources and other opportunities. Like they did a teach-in recently. So we highly recommend you check that out. And as you may know, November is American Indian Heritage Month. The Smithsonian is hosting a wide variety of events, and so we highly recommend that you go to s.si.edu and see if there's anything live or in person or virtual that piques your interest.
Thank you for sharing all those resources, and thank you for being with us tonight. Folks who are out there who made it tonight, thank you, and the folks who are going to be here in the future, thank you as well. We are looking forward to joining you all again at the end of January, where we will focus specifically on the AIDS quilt panel that was put to quilt panels of the 1980s that were put together by lots of folks who were living with and comforting each other through the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. And our question that we will focus on is, how do understandings change when other perspectives are added, specifically to our thinking and our story of democracy in the United States? Megan, thank you for joining us, and we'll turn it over to Eden.
Thank you. Thank you to our moderator and our guests for spending some time with us today. Again, in the comment box are all the links you could possibly need. We really hope that you take advantage of all the resources that we're able to provide to you. And the link for January 31st is not yet live, but it will be checked back on the s.si.edu/NYS link that Megan talked about. It will have our next drop of case studies and the next YouTube video up. You can also check back in on our YouTube and Facebook link at the National Museum of American History or the Smithsonian Education channels. We hope you're all staying safe and healthy this holiday season, and we'll see you all in the new year. Bye, everyone.